Have any of you ever had a moment, probably in your childhood, where you did something so terrible that you were sure you were not going to live past tonight? I had many such moments as a child, but probably the most infamous is what's known in my family as the garage incident. I had just turned 16, and I didn't even have my permit yet. I just had my learners. And my mother, with the truly terrible timing that has become her family trademark, had just purchased a brand new car. It was the first brand new car she had ever owned. And we had a two-car garage at home, but the door had been broken for the last few months and had only that week been fixed. And my mother, of the truly terrible timing, decided that Sunday night, coming home from youth group, was going to be the time that I would learn how to park in the garage. Some of you were ahead of me. Now, the garage door did not have an automatic light, or rather it did, but we just couldn't be arsed to change it after it blew out. I know that only ever happens in my house. So once I pulled in, I couldn't see where I was going. Thankfully, my mother had positioned a set of weight plates at the end of the garage so that you'd know when you'd gone far enough. And as I felt the tires gently rise up on the weights, I punched what I thought was the brake. It was not. And I didn't go far, but I did manage to hit an old kitchen cabinet that was sitting up against the wall. And the two drawers in the cabinet went like two fists through the wall and into the living room, taking about a 3-foot by 3-foot wide section of drywall with it, much to the surprise of my dad, who was sitting just a few feet away from my unintentional demolition derby. And as I'm sitting there, stunned, the door to the house opens, and my father looks at me. And I know I am dead. Fight or flight kicks in, and with all of my 16-year-old wisdom, I bolt out of the car, with the engine still running, mind you, and took off down the block screaming, "He's gonna kill me! He's gonna kill me!" I think it was a solid half hour before I managed to muster enough courage to go back into the house and face the music. And for those of you interested, my punishment consisted of my family hanging a sign over the hole in the wall that said, "Kate's Drive-Thru," in big letters, and then inviting everyone we knew to come over and see it before they got it fixed. I think perhaps this is why the bleeding woman from Mark 5 is one of my all-time favorite characters in the Bible. She, too, is a rule breaker and a chance taker, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But there's so much here that we understand and empathize with. I suspect many of us know someone like this woman as she's described in verse 26. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. I'm sure more than a few of us, including me, know that experience well ourselves. She has filled out the endless paperwork, endured the clumsy probings of the interns and residents at the clinics. She's heard the excuses of doctors who do not want to take on the risk of her pre-existing condition. She was likely infertile in a society where women's entire worth was judged by their ability to bear children. Her search for healing had rendered her destitute. And that is all before we even get to the focus of this passage, which is purity laws. So, and if you want to read more on purity laws, if you're up late some night and need to be put back to sleep, you can check this out in Leviticus 15. But Jewish purity laws forbade anyone to come into contact with a woman for 7 days after the start of her period, or a woman who was bleeding outside of her period. Everything such a woman touched and everyone she came into contact with had to be ritually purified. Now, in consequence of this, all women were already ritually impure more frequently and for longer periods, pun somewhat intended, than men. But Luke tells us that this woman had been hemorrhaging for 12 years. By this time, everyone in her community would know that you don't go anywhere near that woman, especially if you don't have time for a ritual bath. So she has been alone, without significant company or any human touch, for over a decade. Now, Sarah stole one of my points here in their children's message, but can you imagine Some of you can, because you have been in that place with COVID. You were somewhere where you were living by yourself or didn't have access to trusted friends or family. You didn't experience touch. Can you imagine going without touching another human being for 12 years? And all of that meant that she had absolutely no business being in a crowd. And yet, there she was. She's fighting through the press of her neighbors and strangers alike, lunging just to get a touch of Jesus' clothing in the hopes that it will heal what no one else has been able to heal. Anyone who's been to a rock concert, pre-COVID obviously, can imagine the squeeze of people as they got closer and closer to Jesus that day. And yet she manages to push her way through and lay just one hand on Jesus' robe. Now, I want to note something important here, which is that being present and having faith are not the same thing. I'm sure that many of you have heard the saying that going to church doesn't make you a Christian any more than being in a garage makes you a car. But think of the number of people that were around Jesus that day. He has people pressing him and touching him from all directions, but no one else experiences healing like this woman does. It is her faith, not her proximity to Jesus, that allows her to be healed. In fact, she was clearly afraid of attracting Jesus' notice, and yet sought her healing despite the risk. So she approaches Jesus through the crowd kind of furtively. Imagine your 10-year-old sneaking cookies. She's carrying the shame imposed on her by her community's treatment of her illness. And I'm sure that she had every intention of sneaking away exactly as stealthily as she came. She didn't need to make a big production out of it. She didn't need to draw notice to herself. She just wanted to heal. And yet, Jesus makes a point of stopping and calling her forward. At which point I imagine she felt exactly like I did as I watched my father looking at me from behind the wheel of a car. I'm sure that she was certain she would be punished for making the teacher unclean, for making so many people in the crowd unclean. But instead, Jesus does something different. He publicly sanctions her healing. He calls her daughter as an act of solidarity and restoration. The conversation that she has with him in front of 1,000 witnesses pulls her back from the edges of her community into the center. And that was important. With such a deeply personal illness that shows no outward signs, some of you are squirming even just hearing me talk about periods today, and believe me, I sympathize. But the community needed to hear from the teacher that this woman had been healed. They needed to know for sure that he felt safe touching her before she would be accepted back into her community. And the woman, importantly, doesn't just get to furtively take her healing and go on home. She needs to testify to the saving power she has felt through Jesus, to demonstrate why she was healed when everything else failed her, when her community had given up on her, when Jesus himself shouldn't even have been touching her in the first place. So what lessons can we take away from this powerful story? First, we must constantly be listening for God's will in our lives to take us in unexpected directions. Even though the bleeding woman broke purity laws to touch Jesus, it's very clear from his response that she is exactly where she's supposed to be, doing exactly what needed to be done in order to secure her healing. Jesus himself crosses physical, social, and geographic boundaries to heal her and affirm her healing before her community. This woman is believed to be beyond the reach of help and healing, and yet God's holiness is not contained within the boundaries of what we expect. I'm going to say that again. God's holiness is not contained within the bounds of what we expect. The second lesson I hope we take away from this is that in the kingdom of God, relationships will always trump rule following. The bleeding woman takes a great risk, but she is ultimately rewarded by Jesus for breaking the rules. This is a challenge to those of us who see rules and regulations as a comfort. Some of us really believe strongly that if we just follow the rules, everything will be okay. And let me be very, very clear. I'm not saying that anybody should go out and break the law. I am not saying that you need to suddenly let your 10-year-old drive home because who cares? Some laws are important. However, discerning which rules to follow and which rules to break as we follow Jesus has to always be a conversation between us and God. It cannot simply be us deciding to go our own way and trusting that the Spirit will follow. But there will be times for breaking rules in the life of a Christian. Last, I hope that we hear from this passage that when it comes to the healing and helping power of God, there are no barriers we cannot overcome. New Testament scholar Matthew Skinner puts it this way. He says, whatever assails humanity's well-being, all of that appears powerless when faced with the arrival of the reign of God. God invites us, then as now, to make room to be amazed at all that God can do. God's power is beyond the boxes we try to put it in. God's power is beyond the rules we have thought were ours to follow and uphold. God's power is beyond what we believe is possible for us. With that in mind, I have two questions I want to invite you to ponder over this coming week. The first is this: what bleeding women are there in this community who long only to be accepted, to be loved, and to be healed? I spent a long time in work and ministry in downtown DC, and our unhoused neighbors, those struggling with mental illness, women who sold their bodies each night on street corners would all fit that bill. But who in this community, who in your circle is suffering silently? Who is falling through the cracks of traditional safety nets? Who is struggling to be noticed by any means necessary? And how are we being called here at Trinity to be God's hands and feet for them? The second question I want to invite you to ponder is this: when was the last time you felt amazed by God? Like really, truly stop in your tracks, take it all in awe. It's so easy to get caught up in the everyday that we forget to watch for God's movement in and around us. Sometimes it doesn't look like what we expect it to look like. And yet, part of our work as believers is to name and to share and to celebrate the restoring and redeeming power of God in our midst. When was the last time you felt amazed by God? God is still doing amazing things out there. God is yet at work in each of you, in this place, in our community, on all around the world. I invite you to notice and to name all of those places in the coming week, and then come back and tell us what you've seen. Thanks be to God. Amen.